We simply cannot allow people to pour into the United States undetected, undocumented, unchecked.
And complete the dang fence.
This bill that we will sign today is not a revolutionary bill.
Cast down your bucket where you are.
We come from France.
And I am, adamantly against illegal immigrants.
They're coming in by the thousands, just unbelievable.
A wall is an immorality.
Who are you rooting for?
Those masters of the universe are at it again.
You maniac! You blew it up!
Welcome to Parsing Immigration Policy, the podcast of the Center for Immigration Studies. My name is Mark Krikorian, Executive Director of the Center. And now we're going to talk about something that happened a couple months ago, but the legacy media seems to have had very little interest in finding out the details, and yet there are important immigration policy-related details. Specifically, this is the terrorist attack in Chicago, where a Mauritanian border jumper who was released into the country by Joe Biden's Homeland Security Department ended up going to a neighborhood with a lot of Orthodox Jews and started shooting people, yelling Allahu Akbar. It's kind of almost a stereotypical kind of thing, but it was a real attack. And this is the first actual violent terrorist attack that we know of that's been formally charged, because the guy's been charged with terrorism, carried out by a border crossing illegal alien in the United States. So since the legacy media seemed relatively uninterested in finding out what the story was, and apparently the government isn't even all that interested, Todd Bensman on our staff, who's a national security fellow, decided to fly to Chicago and start doing what apparently they used to call reporting, where he called people up and visited them and said, okay, so what's your story? Well, that's what Todd did, and we have a 3-part series released this week on this attack, and I wanted Todd to come in and kind of give us the TLDR version of all those reports, although I fully recommend you read them, but Todd's going to give you kind of a teaser and the basic information about what was in there. So Todd, thanks for coming on the show, and first of all, what's the guy's name and what happened, and what's his background, and what do you think we should do about it?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. And yes, I was a reporter for 20 years, so it's kind of hard to get that out of your bloodstream. I think it's just there like malaria or something, or hepatitis.
Well, except there's a lot of people whose job is being a reporter who don't seem to be all that curious and interested in doing reporting, at least on this subject.
Well, and also, there was another factor in this case, which is that the subject, the defendant, Sidi Mohammad Abdallahi, hanged himself in Cook County Jail.
Right.
So there won't be a trial.
Right.
And I think a lot of people might have been waiting for answers to come out in that trial about, how Border Patrol handled him, how he got in, what his, motivations were exactly, and, how he got the gun and all these other questions. There's not going to be a trial. So all the more reason for somebody to go knock some doors. So on October 26, Sidi decided that he was going to make his way to this, well-known Orthodox Jewish neighborhood. It's a bunch of synagogues all in that area. Everybody knows where they are, and massacre Jews, preferably in their synagogues, authorities believe, on the Sabbath, Saturday.
Mm-hmm.
And on the way there, I guess he couldn't restrain himself. He spotted a Jewish man walking a couple blocks away from the synagogue and shot him point blank in the back. Thankfully, it went through his shoulder and he fell, got back up and started to run. And when Sidi saw that he was up and running and not dead, he came back for him again, fired more rounds at him, missing. And from that point on, for the next 20 minutes after the cops came and paramedics and all the rest, the guy went on a rampage trying to kill police. He would pop in, he'd pop out of people's backyards, running up and down alleys. It went on, and it was a furious gun battle with rounds flying all over that neighborhood. hitting cars and homes and fences and, just really scaring the residents to a degree that nobody in that neighborhood had ever felt. That was a very safe neighborhood, is upper middle class. The homes are all averaging 500,000 and up. They don't see a lot of violent crime, and now there's this gun battle through. The police finally shot him down, critically wounded him, and put an end to the attack, but not before he was able to take a third bunch of shots at his first victim as paramedics were loading him into an ambulance. Right. Shooting at the ambulance, hitting all around, and they, fled to the hospital with their first victim inside. And eventually they were able to arrest him, wounded, and they charged him with terrorism, under a state terrorism statute, which put him as the very first border crossing illegal immigrant from a Muslim majority country, Mauritania, to have conducted a charged terror attack that drew blood in the United States. And this is something that, the intelligence community reporting and director of FBI, Chris Wray, has been publicly warning was going to happen. And it did.
So how did he get into the country in the first place? What's the background there?
Well, all we really know is that, ICE has come out and said he crossed in March of 2023 at San Ysidro from Mexico, basically Tijuana to San Diego. Right. And a lot of the Mauritanians crossed there. We've had well over 20,000 Mauritanian border crossers come into the country. A lot of them come through there, and they did a quick background check on him through databases, which you know how that is. If there's nothing in there, it's not going to bounce. It's not going to...
Basically, if he hasn't been here and committed a crime, then the databases aren't going to show anything.
Right, and also not very likely that, the Mauritanians had him on some kind of terrorism list or anybody else. I mean, if they knew...
If they even have such a thing.
If they have such a thing, right. So after that, we really don't know. We think that he came to Chicago straight away, because one thing that I discovered there that has not been reported is that he has family in town who have never been interviewed, have never surfaced, just that we know that he had family there because they took possession of his body and gave him a funeral and presumably buried him somewhere in the Chicago area after the hanging, the suicide.
Right. So what about his background? Do we know anything about him? Do we know whether he was in contact with overseas groups? Was he, kind of radicalized just by scrolling the internet? What little do we know about that?
Before he hanged himself, there was an arraignment and a hearing in Chicago where prosecutors came out with the evidence that they had for charging him with terrorism, which is that they recovered his phone, which was filled with images and, jihadist propaganda, pro-Hamas, anti-Jewish, anti-Israel, and a telltale sign that he was, animated by maybe the war in Gaza, is that he came to the attack wearing a green workman's vest, which if you look at the demonstrations, photos and videos of the anti-Israel, pro-Hamas demonstrations, they're all wearing these workman's vests, these kind of, and so he was wearing one of those. During the attack, he discarded it because I guess it was pretty visible, Right. And he wanted to do some killing before he got killed. It looked like it was a martyrdom operation, but he had a lot of material on his phone. And it also showed searches and mapping of synagogues in that area, showing that it was very well planned. He searched a Jewish community center as well, the location, and also a gun shop in the suburban town of Lyons, which is not far from the main, city. It's kind of on the outskirts in the west. So, the prosecutors, before he hanged himself, said this was a very well planned, pre-planned attack intended to end with a high body count. That's what he planned. That's not what he got. But it is a terror attack regardless of body count. He was down, the Jewish victim was down, and this guy came over the border.
Right. So some of this, what you're telling us, you found out because you actually conducted the first interview with the victim. You wanted to remain anonymous because you didn't want to, put another target on his back, as it were. But you also talked to some other people. You talked to his rabbi. You went to the gun store, right? I mean, nobody had done this before. I mean, it's just kind of hard to believe the Chicago Tribune or somebody didn't send somebody to talk to these people.
Well, I mean, there was sort of perfunctory reporting, when the shooting happened, there was a lot of reporting a shooting happened. When he was arrested, there was and arraigned, there was another round of reporting. But it was just sort of turn of the screw sort of reporting. And nobody really did the normal thing that, we had to do when I was a young reporter, which is to go out and knock doors and try to find out everything you could about the shooter and the victim. Right. But, I went to the shooter's address of his home and talked to two of his roommates who told me that nobody other than the police had bothered coming there. I think they said there might have been one local television station that showed up and filmed the apartment. But, nobody tried really. And the victim, of course, had not given any interviews. He's not identified publicly. He does not want to be identified. As you said, doesn't want to be targeted again.
Right.
Hadn't given an interview either, and neither had his rabbi. Nobody really in the Jewish community was really interviewed about, like, how did they feel about, the illegal immigration situation there in Chicago that brought him there.
Right.
And, Chicago's a very liberal precinct. Orthodox Jews tend to vote center-right, but, most Jews are voting on the center-left or even more, especially in a place like Chicago. So I think that's part of why maybe the local media and national media didn't really want to touch this. It happened also 1 week before the national election, which, as we all know, was, predicated on the mass migration crisis. You had Trump out there. I don't think anybody was too eager to give Trump this gift-wrapped package of a border-crossing terrorist shooting up Jews in Chicago, Blue Precinct, just ahead of the election. That's my speculation anyway.
And it's interesting that I think both because of this, but also because of Chicago Mayor, what's his name, Johnson, I think, who has said he's going to resist ICE's, under Trump, ICE's immigration push, that Tom Homan has said, well, we're going to start in Chicago. And so it seems to me that this event might well have contribute to that decision when you combine that with the Chicago mayor's kind of open defiance of federal law, sort of South Carolina nullification style, back in the 1860s.
Yeah. So, one thing that I think the country can expect is, kind of a toe-to-toe battle between Tom Homan and Mayor Johnson, Brandon Johnson, over the planned deportations. And I think that, the Trump administration, the incoming Trump people already well know about this terror attack and are probably going to cite it in this upcoming battle. So I don't think we've heard the last of this particular event because, we know that Donald Trump is already aware of it. In his very last campaign speech, he brought it up and spoke about it. It didn't get quoted anywhere. It was something new that he sort of introduced there at the end, the day before the election. So nobody quoted him, but they surely know about this. And so I think that whatever reporting that we've done is probably going to be useful in a public service sense because it will help inform whatever debate happens there in Chicago. Right.
And all the more so because nobody else has done any of this. Nobody's bothered to try to interview the victim or some of the neighbors. You went in one of your reports, you talked to a neighbor, you have a picture of a bullet hole in somebody's windshield. It's just malpractice that nobody else did this before us. But, I guess it's good for us because, we did it and we have the first real reporting on this. again, the series is called First Blood because the first blood drawn by a border-jumping illegal alien in a terrorist attack. And it's online at cis.org. But the third part of your 3-part series is solutions. In other words, what do we do about this? This kind of relates to your point about Tom Homan coming to Chicago for day one, but it's not just about Chicago. It's a broader issue, obviously. And so what are some of the takeaways, the policy takeaways from this attack that would apply more broadly and maybe make this kind of thing less likely in the future?
Right. Well, first you have to recall that the intelligence community, not Todd Bensman or CIS, has been warning increasingly of a terror attack coming from the border. It's them. In their 2024 and 2025 Homeland Threat Assessments, both of them talk about this mass migration crisis at the border, irregular immigration. They use their own sort of politically correct terminology. Whatever you want to call it, they're saying that it has really elevated this threat. And now that one has actually happened, the idea is that, well, why wouldn't it happen again and then again?
Right.
Because many, many tens of thousands of people from countries like Mauritania, Muslim majority countries, they're called countries of terrorist concern or of national security interest. They're on lists. The intelligence community makes lists. And they call the people from those countries special interest aliens. And for years, we've had counterterrorism programs down there on the border to kind of do secondary inspections on special interest aliens. All of them have to stand over here and then undergo interviews and pocket trash collection. And there's this whole program that we've written about many times here. Well, in the Biden administration, that counterterrorism apparatus has just simply fallen to pieces and is no longer being used on maybe a fraction, a tiny minuscule fraction of special interest aliens, so we can figure out who they are.
Right. And just to be clear, this is a larger group than people on the terrorism watch list. The terrorism watch list is for individuals that they have some reason to be concerned about. The special interest aliens are just anybody who comes from a list of countries that have a significant terrorism presence and therefore warrant some extra, investigation.
That's right. They're not terrorists. That doesn't mean they're terrorists. That they're just simply good for secondary inspection to make sure they're not terrorists, which is perfectly acceptable. I mean, like who wouldn't be in favor of extra security and interviews for people coming from those countries who are total strangers?
Alejandro Mayorkas, apparently.
Yeah, well, okay. But, normal people would think that that's perfectly in line with, for example, his predecessor, one of his predecessors, Jay Johnson under the Obama administration. In my third piece, I open it up with a memorandum that he wrote ordering all of his DHS people to put together an SIA task force that would make sure that it was properly resourced and that everything that agents needed down there, they got, and that there was, aggressive vetting happening for SIAs, special interest aliens coming in over the border. And my first recommendation is to resurrect Jay Johnson's plan because it never made it to fruition. We have to restore, if you want to block or reduce the risk of new attacks, that's what you have to do. You have to restore those protocols down there, the vetting that's happening down there. And so that's number one. And there's a kind of a baker's dozen of other recommendations in there that are in the interior. When they do start doing mass deportations, I'm recommending that ICE have some teams together that specifically look for special interest aliens to sort of belatedly do the security vetting interviews on as many as they possibly can. For USCIS, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services personnel to, go after asylum fraud cases involving special interest aliens to make sure that there's always detention space to hold them until these are finished. There's a whole raft of things in the interior that we can and should be doing, but also abroad. For example, the Darien Gap, through which the vast majority of special interest aliens and terrorists, and probably Abdullahi himself, his roommates that I interviewed said they came through the Darien Gap, that it be closed. The new president down there, I went to the Darien, I interviewed Panamanian officials, and they're ready to close the gap. They just need air repatriation funding and maybe some air assets. Give it to them. Give them what they need. Do the same thing in Colombia and Costa Rica and maybe even Mexico too. But ultimately, it's, if you're looking for needles in a haystack, you want the haystack to be as small as possible. So I think that that's already what the administration is planning to do, is to reduce the overall haystack, which will facilitate and help all of these recommendations, the restoration of these programs. But you're still going to have the problem of maybe 100,000 SIAs that got in the last few years, maybe more.
Right.
Nobody really knows. Right. So they're here. And the question is, how do we find them, vet them, or remove them? That's going to be an issue.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And your point about the haystack, shrinking the haystack so the needle's easier to find for me, that's like job one, because large scale illegal immigration, even of just ordinary guys coming to work, do construction and do dishwashing, still serves as a kind of cover, if unintentional, for bad guys, whether they're terrorists, whether they're criminals, what have you. And so the smaller the flow, the better job you're going to be doing, not just in overall immigration control, but also in the security, counterterrorism, anti-crime elements of immigration control. And I thought this was particularly important that we released this week, because this week is also the 10th anniversary of the Charlie Hebdo massacre in France, which was part of the terrorism fallout of Europe's immigration disaster that they invited, specifically the German Chancellor Angela Merkel, basically prefiguring Joe Biden's role in effect, inviting mass illegal immigration. And they had real enormous terrorism consequences in France and other countries. But the Charlie Hebdo still is, in fact, a satirical magazine in France. And frankly, they're probably kind of jerks. I mean, but they should be free to be jerks. And they made fun of everybody, including Muslims and Mohammed and what have you. And so 10 years ago, there was a terrorist attack, killed a whole bunch of people working at this magazine, writers and cartoonists and what have you. That's the kind of thing that you can see. And we've been lucky that this is the first, so far, terrorist attack by a illegal alien border jumper. But, if we don't do something about it, it seems to me we're headed down the road for more things, potentially like Charlie Hebdo massacre or other things that have happened in Europe.
Right. And, why be so incurious about this? Because it is true that, the Europeans suffered many, many, many terror attacks from border crossing special interest aliens. They don't call them special interest aliens, but, they conducted bloody mayhem across the continent over there. And now the majority of the people coming into the European theater were from Muslim majority countries, Afghanistan and Syria, unlike here. But we have had more cross our border than ever before in such a short time. We used to have 3,000 or 4,000 a year, and there have been some good reporting out there that 75,000 came in, 100,000 just in the last year or two.
From countries of terrorism concern?
Yes, from countries of terrorism concern, largely unvetted, and tens of thousands have come in over the using the CBP One parole app. The scheme where we walk them in over the bridges or let them fly in over the border, and those people are minimally vetted from countries that don't really have systems in place to help us out. But really, one of the strange kind of unanswered questions here is, where was the FBI on this? FBI just sort of took a back seat. This is the Chicago field office. I've been in communication with them by email saying, hey, now that the suspect is dead, what can you say your involvement was in this case? Because they just ceded the investigation to the local police, who are ill-equipped to do terrorism investigations.
Sure.
To be able to find out whether there were co-conspirators, how did he get his gun, illegal immigrants. And in fact, most Chicagoans have a hard time getting a gun in that jurisdiction. How did that happen? We don't know any of those questions, I think, because the FBI just left it to the state and locals to investigate and charge. And they told me that now that the suspect was dead, that they are closing whatever support case that they had open.
Unbelievable.
And that's that. So I don't know how we're ever going to find out a lot of this. We have filed FOIAs with all of the federal agencies involved: ICE, Border Patrol, FBI, the county medical examiner's office, the police department. We have wallpapered the whole thing. So I don't think that this is over yet. For us, number one, Homan and the Trump administration are undoubtedly going to mention this. If they don't, they should, because this is the ultimate argument for, deporting people that might be terrorists or are terrorists or criminal aliens who are, lawfully deportable.
Right.
So why are you going to protect people like Abdullahi? Abdullahi, were he alive before the attack, maybe even after, would have been protected, surrounded by a cocoon of protection, political protection under Mayor Johnson.
Right.
So I think we're still going to hear a lot, and hopefully we'll get material back on our FOIAs, and that we won't have to sue like we have in the past, and that it just comes flowing forth. But I'm not.
But if we do have to sue, we're going to sue. We've done that, as you referred to, on a whole bunch of other FOIA requests. Hopefully, though, as you said, with the change in administrations, maybe they're going to be a little more forthcoming and transparent. I expect they will be.
And Mark, that transparency isn't demanded only by the broader American public or people like me and you, but also the Jewish community there.
Right.
The rabbi, when I interviewed him, Matanki is his name, he had a whole list of questions that he really wanted to know, that his community really wanted to know. And when I interviewed the victim, they're dying to know what this was all about. How did he get in?
Right.
How did he get to Chicago? What was he doing? What was his, associations with, maybe other people like-minded? And the main thing is they're like, if we don't have the answer to these questions, how do we know all of his friends aren't going to follow in his footsteps and hit us again here in our neighborhood?
Absolutely. And it's interesting, your point about the FBI basically ceding the case to the local cops and then kind of closing their involvement really does point to a problem that when stuff like this happens, it seems to me in an immigration context, there needs to be a full after-action report or a postmortem about what went wrong here. In other words, it's not so much looking for, scapegoats or anything, but where did we fall short and how do we fix it? It seems to me that's an obvious thing any organization should do anytime something happens that they don't want it to happen. In other words, not even in an immigration or a terrorism context. When you screw something up, if you're a car manufacturer and your cars are coming out screwed up, you'll look at why did this happen? What do we change to make it less likely this problem is going to happen in the future?
Exactly.
And this kind of thing, every time, and you've got this whole list of, we have on the website, a database you put together of vetting failures. I'm not sure this is, maybe this would fit in that category. Maybe it would, maybe it won't. But there's all kinds of vetting failures, opportunities that were lost. And, maybe it couldn't have been stopped with better vetting. Who knows? But you at least have to take a hard look at what happened and whether policy changes would have fixed this. And it just seems, especially under the current, short-timer administration, they just weren't interested in doing that.
No, they weren't. And, I think that, there was no body count here. Nobody died in this attack. But it was a dramatic, white-knuckled, oh my God, terror attack. with a guy shouting Allahu Akbar, it shouldn't matter whether there was a high or low body count to justify inquiry and introspection for lessons learned. Because why do we have to wait until there is a high body count to do that?
Exactly. And, it's interesting. I think one of the reasons there's reluctance to do this, you've kind of alluded to it, is that, it would be politically incorrect. There's the old Norm Macdonald joke about, it would be terrible if there were a nuclear attack that killed 50 million Americans. Imagine, the discomfort the Muslim community would face. You know what I mean? That's it's become kind of this, but I mean, it's true. And you're seeing the same kind of thing, not in a terrorism context, but in England with this whole story that's come back up in the news about these rape gangs of Pakistani immigrants preying literally on underage English girls. And, obviously it's a different issue, but I think the reason that wasn't addressed and confronted forthrightly is similar to the reason that the legacy media and the FBI and others kind of would rather this attack that you wrote about go away as well, is that it's politically inconvenient and uncomfortable for them, and so they'd rather avert their eyes if possible.
And there was a controversy over exactly that. The Jewish community in the immediate aftermath of this attack noted that the authorities did not say that the victim was Jewish or that the perpetrator was Muslim wearing the green vest. Because remember, the backdrop here is that there have been a lot of pro-Hamas, anti-Israel demonstrations in Chicago, like everywhere else, at the campuses and everything else. And the aldermen and state legislators and the mayor sort of, had sympathy on that side.
Right.
They're on that side. And here we had an attack that just wrecked their narrative. Mm-hmm. Now you had Jews being attacked here in Chicago by a Muslim who no less breached the border before he did it. And immigration is, obviously a sore spot in Chicago because there are tens of thousands that settled there. And there are a lot of people that don't like it. And Trump did well comparatively in Chicago and other places where lots of immigrants showed up. And nobody really wanted to bring that up either in the institutional media or the realms of political leaders and, really anybody else. And the Jewish community was furious. And they spoke out. Said, why aren't you talking about us? We got attacked. And finally, they came around. There was a lot of pressure brought to bear, and that's why they charged it as a terrorism case. They also threw a hate crime in there, too. And the rabbi was saying, they charged it with terrorism, and we're glad, but they only did it because we made them do it. They didn't do the right thing on their own. And what he's talking about there is that political sort of sensitivity on the other toward the other side.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. Well, thanks for coming in and filling us in on this. The series is called First Blood. It's 3 reports, not super long, but gives some real detail with some good photographs to illustrate it of what this attack was about, what the attacker was about, his own background to the extent we know anything, and maybe some steps that we could take to make this kind of thing less likely in the future. It's online at cis.org. We'll obviously have a link to it in the show notes as well. So thanks for coming on, Todd, and we will obviously, unfortunately, I guess, have you back when more tragedies or outrages, I guess is the right word, happen in the future that could have or should have been avoided by better immigration enforcement.
Thanks for having me. I don't think we've heard the last of this case yet. Chicago is going to be a battleground here soon.
Great. Thank you. And finally, today, I wanted to just have a few thoughts about a bill that recently passed the House of Representatives this week, the Laken-Riley Act. And the legislation would sort of require the deportation of illegal immigrants who commit certain crimes. more crimes than are already required for deportation. In other words, expand the ability to deport illegal immigrants who commit crimes. Of course, every illegal immigrant is deportable anyway at all times. So nonetheless, it's something. It's in one sense, it's better than nothing. You can't have everything. A bird in the hand, better than two in the bush, as they say. On the other hand, the fact that a significant number of Democrats, I think it was more than 40 Democrats, voted for this in the House of Representatives, even though most Democrats voted against it, does suggest a downside of this kind of targeted, focused legislation, and that is that the Democrats who voted for this, and frankly some of the Republicans, are people who aren't actually in favor of the broader and more important measures to limit illegal immigration overall. And as Todd said, in a terrorism context, but this applies in the crime context too, you have to have a smaller haystack to make sure it's easier to find the needle who's a terrorist or a criminal or what have you. And the potential problem with this kind of legislation is that it offers a political cover for politicians so that they can say they're tough on immigration, but not endorse and not promote the more important measures that can reduce illegal immigration more generally. Things like E-Verify or worksite enforcement in general to make it harder for illegal immigrants to be able to find work and therefore make it less appealing to be an illegal alien. That kind of thing is less popular because there are a lot of donors who don't like it. And so voting for something like the Lake and Riley Act, as emotionally cathartic as it may seem, for a lot of politicians is a substitute for doing the many other things that are necessary to control immigration, not a supplement, which is the way I think most of the Republicans who voted for this do see it. Clearly, that's why the Republican leadership in both houses is pushing it. It's apparently going to come up. I don't know what the date is, but it'll come up for a vote in the Senate as well. And they're going to have 7 Democrats at least vote for it, assuming all Republicans vote for it, in order for it to actually be sent to the president's desk. And again, I think the motivation of the people pushing the bill is sound, is good. The problem is that it gives cover to people who don't want to control immigration, but want to be able to tell voters that they're contributing to solutions when in fact they're obstacles to solutions. That's it for this week's episode of Parsing Immigration Policy. This is Mark Krikorian. If you have suggestions, complaints, compliments, what have you, email us at center@cis.org. If the platform you get this podcast on allows you to rate or review us, please do that. And thank you for tuning in. Thanks to Todd for taking the time to walk us through the story. Thank you to our producer, Brian Griffith, for making this sound like an actual professional operation. And I hope you tune in next week for our next episode.